Welcome, everyone. My name is Jess Posner. My pronouns are she and they, and I am the director of the Virtual Y at the YMCA of Central New York. I am a white woman in her mid-30s with brown asymmetrical hair and black-rimmed glasses. I'm wearing a patterned black and yellow dress, and the background behind me is a dynamic blue and purple Y-branded digital background. I am honored to welcome you to today's virtual Lunch and Learn seminar, Youth Mental Health, Finding a Common Language with Mary diGiovanna from Helio Health. Before I introduce our guests, I'd like to orient us to our virtual meeting platform, Zoom. Please keep your audio muted for the entire program unless you are invited to unmute. If you would like to communicate with me or ask questions, please use the chat function, which you can access on the bottom of your screen if you are joining in on a computer, or in the three dots if you are joining via mobile or tablet. Following the presentation, there will be time for Q&A, so please do share those questions with us in the chat. We may also have an opportunity to kind of unmute and have conversations with one another. So that may be something that we can do if folks are comfortable with that as well. We have enabled live transcription of this event. From a computer, you can turn this on by clicking the live transcript or the CC icon in the menu at the bottom of your screen and selecting show subtitle. From mobile or tablet, you can access these settings by clicking the three dots. Finally, you will notice that today's event is being recorded. Only the speaker's video feeds will be included in any publicly shared version of this event, and anyone who isn't myself or Mary, we will block out your name for privacy reasons. From a computer, you can adjust sorry about that, you guys. We suggest viewing today's program in speaker view, which will spotlight our speaker today. From a computer, you can adjust this in the upper right-hand corner of the Zoom window by clicking view. From mobile or tablet, you should automatically be in speaker view, but you can swipe to change your views. Once our guests begin screen sharing their presentation, you'll notice that their image becomes quite small. You can change the scale of these windows in the screen share view by sliding a little gray bar that will pop up between the speaker view of the slide presentation. So have fun with that. It's kind of a cool feature. And finally, I just want to thank everyone for your generosity in creating a beautiful community space of listening and learning around this very important topic this afternoon. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our esteemed guest, Mary diGiovanna. Mary diGiovanna is a licensed mental health counselor and is the clinic director for Helio Health's Child and Adolescent Outpatient Clinic. Mary completed her master's degree in counseling psychology at Loyola University, Maryland, and has experience working in an inpatient psychiatric setting as a vocational psychology associate and as an outpatient therapist in school-based and community clinic settings. Mary has been with Helio Health for 5 years, working in the outpatient setting in both clinical and administrative roles. Mary is passionate about social justice and meeting the mental health needs of the community through both treatment and advocacy. Helio Health is a comprehensive, evidence-based, and clinically progressive substance use disorders and mental health disorders service provider. Helio Health operates robust services in Syracuse, Rochester, Binghamton, Gloversville, and Utica, New York. Helio Health's mission is to promote recovery from the effects of substance use and mental health disorders and other health issues, and they have an incredible amount of services and resources available on their website. So without further ado, I turn the virtual spotlight over to you, Mary.
Thank you, Jess. Okay. Hi, everyone. I am so grateful to be able to be here and talk to you all today. And I use she, her pronouns. So let me share this slideshow so we can get into our content. Okay. Like Jess said, my name is Mary. I am the clinic director for our Helio's Outpatient Child and Adolescent Clinic. And I'm going to talk about so youth mental health in general, and finding a common language is kind of the theme that runs throughout. So how to have these conversations. So hopefully this is a good starting point. My goals for this presentation are to talk about youth mental health, to talk about the trends we've seen over the past few years. I want to talk about the effect of technology and social media on youth mental health, with some of the information we're starting to get as we see this rise of technology use in social media. And then I want to leave everyone with some ideas about how to start conversations with the youth in their lives about their mental health, about taking care of themselves, and about the impact that all this technology and social media might have. All right, so first, Jess gave us a little bit of an intro, but I kind of want to give you all a little bit more of an overview of Helio Health, our outpatient clinic, so you have an understanding of the kind of scope that we work within, the practice that we have. So we have an outpatient clinic right in downtown Syracuse on N Salina St. Helio Health is a pretty big agency. For those of you who are familiar, we were previously known as Syracuse Behavioral Healthcare, and we changed our name in 2018 to reflect kind of the broadening of the services we're providing across the state. So we do have services in Syracuse, of course, in Rochester and Binghamton, and in the Utica area. But our main outpatient clinic is in Syracuse, and it's our biggest outpatient clinic. In 2017, our outpatient clinic became what's known as a Certified Community Behavioral Health Center, or a CCBHC. Is how we refer to it, which is when the CNA, or the Child and Adolescent Clinic, developed. So we didn't exist prior to 2017. So in a lot of ways, we're really in our infancy, but we've been able to provide a lot of services and have grown so much, I think, which really shows this trend in youth mental health coming into conversation, coming into light, and us noticing that there really is a need in the community for these services. So our Child and Adolescent Clinic provides outpatient counseling, case management services, psychiatric rehabilitation services, and psychiatry services for youth ages 0 to 21. And our main outpatient clinic serves all ages. So we kind of have an adult services side as well that serves ages 18 and up. So we're really able to treat the whole lifespan. We have a multidisciplinary team. So we have mental health counselors, we have social workers, marriage and family therapists, we have creative arts therapists, and we have certified substance abuse therapists as well. So they're able to look kind of across the scope of disciplines. In addition to our main outpatient clinic, we provide outpatient services. We have clinic services, what we call satellites, in 18 schools across 5 districts in Onondaga County. And we have a plan to expand into 3 additional schools for this upcoming fall school year. And that's adding 1 additional district. And then we have some future plans to add additional districts as well. So we're really looking at what the need in the community is and working with the county to try to meet that need and provide access to services. Okay, so getting into more of our content here, I want to talk about the importance of naming some of these youth mental health trends and why it's so important for parents, guardians, for adults in general to be attuned to youth mental health needs. So we want to think about mental health needs as an essential part of our overall health. So mental health is shaped by both biological factors, so genetics, and environmental factors. Mental health affects how we think about ourselves, how we think about the world, how we solve problems, how we cope with stress, how we overcome challenges, how we connect with and relate to others, how we perform at school and at work, how we function throughout life. So mental health fluctuates, so it improves, it declines, it changes over and throughout time in response to these life circumstances, in response to stressors in our development and all of those things. So with the growing wealth of information available online that allows all of us, including our youth, to have access to a deeper understanding of mental health, we've seen that a lot of the negative stigma around mental health has gotten challenged and broken down, which is a really great thing. So with more information, with more access, we're breaking down these barriers. So we know that mental health issues don't need to be kept secret as much, don't need to feel so intimidating anymore. More and more people are willing to engage in therapy, to seek help, to prioritize their mental wellness as an important part of their overall functioning. And I think the fact that everyone is here today and engaging in this content is a really good representation of that. Excuse me. So in December of 2021, our Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, released an advisory on youth mental health, naming that youth mental health is a public health issue and it demands immediate awareness and action. I think what's really important to note about this is that while there have been Surgeon General advisories about mental health in general, this is the first Surgeon General advisory about youth mental health. So we're really bringing this into light, naming it specifically, and focusing on it and focusing our dollars on it, which is important. So I copied this graphic right out of that Surgeon General's advisory because I thought it really represented these factors. And I think it's helpful to look at kind of these layers. And as we're going through the presentation today, considering these layers as we're thinking about everything. So at the top layer, we're thinking about society. So we all exist within our society, right? So we're thinking about social and economic inequalities, discrimination, racism, migration, media and technology. It's a big thing that we're talking about today. Popular culture, government, all of that, right? Moving down, our physical environment. So our neighborhood, safety in our neighborhood, access to green spaces, parks, access to healthy food, access to housing, access to healthcare, pollution, natural disasters, climate change, all huge topics. Moving down, our community. So relationships with peers, teachers, mentors, our faith communities, our school communities, academic pressure, community support, all those things. Then we can kind of move inside the home to our family. So we're thinking about relationships with our parents, our caregivers, our siblings. Family mental health plays a huge role. Financial stability, domestic violence, trauma, the things that can happen kind of within the household that really impact our mental health. And then the individual level. So our age, our genetics, our race, our ethnicity, our gender, sexual orientation, disability, all of these things, like the things that make up who we are. So thinking about this whole spectrum and how that impacts all of us. Okay, so I want to highlight some of the statistics. These statistics are, I think, quite notable and in some ways alarming. And I think it's important to talk about them so that we have a view of what is going on and we can kind of target and look at what we need to address, right? So we can hopefully problem solve. So we know we have some data from pre-pandemic, and I think it's important to highlight this pre-pandemic. We really have seen some emerging data from the pandemic, but we're still working on a lot of that data gathering. So more to come in the future for that. But pre-pandemic, so data from 2019 shows us that we've had a 40% increase in depression symptoms for high school aged youth as compared to data from 2009. So that's pretty significant. We see that more than 1 in 3 high school students struggle with depression symptoms, so are endorsing having some level of depression symptoms. We see that 1 in 5, so 20% of youth between the ages of 3 and 17 are diagnosed with a mental, emotional, developmental, or behavioral disorder. It's a pretty high number. Data from 2019 shows us that 19% of high school students endorse experiencing suicidal ideation in the past year. Suicidal ideation is those thoughts of wanting to die. So this is a 36% increase from the data we saw in 2009, pretty big. We also see that 16% of high school students in 2019 were endorsing having a plan for suicide within the last year. So not just thoughts about wanting to die, but thoughts about how that they would do that. Excuse me. This was a 44% increase from the data in 2009. So again, notable. Recent data, some more recent pandemic data indicates that Black children are nearly twice as likely to die by suicide than white children. That's a big deal. We know that youth growing up in poverty are 2 to 3 times more likely to develop a mental health issue as compared to their peers with a higher socioeconomic status. Global data has shown us that youth struggling with depression and anxiety has doubled during the pandemic. Data shows that 25% of youth have endorsed experiencing depression symptoms and 20% of youth experience anxiety. Overall, we've seen an increase in youth psychiatric ER visits over the last decade. From 2011 to 2015, youth psychiatric visits to the ER increased by 28%. And then more recent data, so early 2021 data, show us that U.S. emergency room visits for suspected suicide attempts are up by 51% for adolescent girls and by 4% for adolescent boys. Significant. And from 2007 to 2018, suicide rates among youth in the U.S. increased by 57%, and we've continued to see those numbers increase. So to give you some context, some more recent context, it's estimated that there were more than 6,600 deaths by suicide among 10 to 24-year-olds in 2020. So pretty big numbers. So just to highlight some of the stressors youth are facing, I think we're aware of all of these things. COVID-19, so pandemic, this is something that we're all facing, a storm that we're all in. For youth in particular, that has really equated to changes in their school system, changes in their day-to-day school lives, isolation from peers, worries about their general health, worries about their family's health, worries about their family's finances, significant disruption in development related to the isolation, related to going home, right? So our youth went home in March of 2020, and some of them didn't go back to an in-person school setting until this most recent school year. And we've continued to have versions of hybrid schedules, and it's just been a lot of change, right? Additionally, it's estimated that as of June of 2021, so a little over a year into the pandemic, but also more than a year ago, 140,000 children in the US had lost a parent or a grandparent caregiver to COVID. So that's a lot. So we're talking about long-term significant attachment and trauma effects from all of this. We've also seen that access to mental health care has significantly declined during the pandemic, and this has disproportionately affected high-risk populations. So youth with disabilities, minority youth, LGBTQ youth, youth living in rural areas, youth from immigrant households, youth involved in the child welfare system or juvenile justice system, homeless youth. So important to kind of keep in mind those high-risk categories. We've all experienced an ongoing crisis of racial injustice. Over the last few years, I think more and more we've been seeing this and exposed to secondary trauma related to the racial injustices in our country. There's been an ongoing and increasing sense of lack of safety in school buildings and other public places. I think we've all experienced this just to some extent since Sandy Hook, but more and more, I think, particularly with media content, we're seeing it, we're feeling it, we're seeing an increase in these mass shootings, and it's scary. We've seen emerging legislation targeting transgender youth. Fortunately, we haven't seen that in New York State, but I think that it's important that this is something that our country is facing, and this is something that our youth in New York and outside of New York are exposed to and experiencing in these virtual spaces. We're experiencing climate change, huge for our generation, for the next generations, as we're looking at what the future holds, what it's going to look like. These are really scary things. And then we just have the general stress of adolescence. So being an adolescent is stressful in general. We're trying to find a sense of self. We're developing peer relationships. We have all of the normal developmental challenges that come along with growing up. And then we add in all this other stuff that's going on. So we can really see and understand why youth are struggling and what's happening. All right. So I wanted to ground us all by talking more specifically about some of the common terms we use related to mental health symptoms. We're familiar with all these terms to some extent or another, and most of us probably experience some of these symptoms from time to time, but I think it's really important to have this grounded sense of what each term means so that you can help your child or the youth that you interact with define their feelings and experiences, and so that you can clearly communicate and help your children, your youth, your family members clearly communicate. So we need to have a shared definition before we can move forward with our communication. One of the important things that we should consider when we think about mental health symptoms is that we all experience these symptoms at times, so that these symptoms exist on a spectrum. So the experience of anxiety or depression doesn't equate to the diagnosis of a mood disorder, but persistent or chronic experience of these symptoms does tell you that further evaluation or treatment could be helpful. So we can think about our mental health in a similar way to how we think about our physical health. Having regular checkups is really important. And when things aren't feeling good and we have some sense that our bodies aren't working the way we want to talk to a professional. So I want to kind of start with anxiety. We think about fear and worry when we think about anxiety. Fear is the emotional and physiological response to a real threat, and anxiety is the anticipation of a future threat. Often the level of fear or anxiety can be decreased by avoidance behaviors. So avoiding triggers for anxiety, engaging in certain behaviors to control that anxiety. Those are important things to look out for when you're thinking about anxiety. Anxiety is often accompanied by that stress response as well. So that those physiological changes in your body, that fight or flight kind of response. We see school avoidance with anxiety, social anxiety, of course, test anxiety, phobias, ruminating thoughts. There's a lot that kind of falls into the category of anxiety. When we think about depression, we think about sadness or irritability. And then sadness or irritability accompanied by significant impairment in functioning when it reaches kind of clinical levels. So we all have times when we feel sad or irritated, of course, but that impairment in functioning is the important kind of trigger. We also see somatic disturbances and changes in cognitive functioning with depression, things like loss of interest in things that were previously enjoyable, changes in appetite and sleeping, changes in energy level, changes in physical movement, difficulty thinking, difficulty concentrating, making decisions, feelings of worthlessness or guilt, and then thoughts of suicide often come with symptoms of depression. ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or attention deficit disorder. It's kind of goes back and forth between those two terms. We see inattention, we see hyperactivity, we see impulsivity. I think people by and large are pretty familiar overall with this idea about ADHD. It's become much more common as a diagnosis. It's become much more common in kind of in our day-to-day lingo. What's really important as we're thinking about evaluating youth is that we consider their developmental trajectory, where they are, how old they are. A lot of the symptoms that we see with ADHD are just common parts of being a young kid. So when we're looking at a 6-year-old, we really need to take into account that environment, the developmental factors, all of that. Another important thing to consider is that there's some overlap in symptoms between depression and ADHD in youth. So depression can present as increased irritability, changes in movements like hyperactivity, impulsivity in school-age children and adolescents. Typically, we don't see those types of things with depression in adults. We see more of the common kind of lethargy, sadness type symptoms with depression. We see a bit more of the irritability, the movement stuff with teens. So important to kind of keep that in mind, and important to ask for a professional opinion, right, when you're looking at what your child is experiencing. We also know that medication can help with ADHD symptoms often because it kind of affects the way our brain functions to help us better have control over our impulses, make decisions, etc. We also know that there's a really high correlation between attachment issues, so stressors during early childhood and our brain development. And those types of attachment issues can come out in ADHD type symptoms, and that's something that gets explored during counseling. So those are important parts of this idea about seeking professional help and viewing some of these problems through that professional lens. And then we have trauma and adjustment. I think it's important to talk about trauma and adjustment in the context of COVID and everything that's going on, because that's what we're seeing. So exposure to a traumatic or stressful event followed by significant psychological distress and impairment in functioning is how we define kind of a trauma disorder. An adjustment an adjustment disorder is a similar version of that. So we see an adjustment disorder as impairment in functioning distress related to a change, related to a stressor. So going home from being in school, that's an adjustment, that's a stressor. Typically with an adjustment disorder, we see those symptoms resolve with about 6 months. So as a professional, we evaluate how the symptoms are going. And if it's been longer than 6 months and that individual is still really struggling with those symptoms, we look at potentially having some other diagnosis or what else might be going on. But something to hold this idea that it's important to consider that we can struggle with adjustment. We often also see our trauma responses mirroring anxiety and mirroring those fear-based responses. But with trauma, we see this additional dissociation, anhedonia, externalized angry or aggressive behavior. So some additional symptoms than what we typically see with anxiety. Okay, so kind of moving into this common language idea, I want to talk about communication and language between generations. So we know that language changes over time. We refer to this as language drift, and this can cause a divide between generations. Specifically, kind of in this context, we're talking about this divide between children and parents or grandparents, so the caregiver. The day-to-day language that we all use develops and changes over time. This is mostly related to social factors. We know that from birth to age 12, we speak like our parents and not like our family members. So we speak like the people we're around the most. And then during adolescence, we see a shift in our language and we end up speaking like our peers speak. And then as we move into adulthood, our language tends to shift back, becomes a bit more conservative again. You know, folks are going into the workplace, conforming to kind of norms around workplace environments, things like that. But kind of getting back to this idea about language during adolescence, during our teen years, we speak like our peers, less like our parents. This change in language, this shift, helps us to reinforce social connection and belonging to a group. So we start to shift away from our family group and we shift more into the social and peer groups that align with our developing identity. Adolescents tend to be the most linguistically innovative. So they invent and use slang in new and creative ways. We've seen this generation after generation. It's really cool. Language during adolescence also tends to adhere less closely to standard English. So it's less conservative in comparison to how adults speak. So again, there's that barrier in some ways, this kind of difference. So I have this meme here that I wanted to use as an example of language. And I think the idea of memes in general, too, we've really seen as technology has increased these types of things like memes and GIFs and all of that. But in this case, I'm kind of highlighting the phrase on fleek, which is a bit of an old phrase, but I thought this meme was fun. So we see these kind of phrases such as on fleek that get created, they become really popular, people start using them, adolescents start using them, and then they kind of fade away. So we know like on fleek is not something that's really used so much anymore, but there was like peak popularity in 2015-ish. And we see examples of these kind of slang words all the time. And it can feel really intimidating to parents or to adults to try to communicate with an adolescent. Because that adolescent is using language that feels totally foreign or not understandable. That language can really be a barrier in communication. The point I'm making with all of this, I hope what you're taking away, is that if we can kind of shift how we think about these generational language divides, specifically that each generation and subculture will create its own dialect, we can move into this mindset where we find these dialects creative and interesting rather than a barrier to communication. So as an adult caregiver or parent, you don't need to understand every word your teen uses. You don't need to know what on fleek means in order to communicate effectively, in order to listen and empathize and connect with your child. Okay. So moving more into the technology side of things. So I want to briefly look at some of the specific data around adolescent screen use. I don't think this information is going to be really surprising to most of us, but it is important to consider as we're thinking about the content and exposure our adolescents and our youth are having when they're using technology. So I pulled this data from the Common Sense Census, which I've linked. It was released in March of 2022, and the data was compiled from surveying tweens and teens. So tweens being defined as ages 8 to 12 and teens being defined as 13 to 18. So the whole group, 8 to 18. So they were surveyed about their entertainment technology use in 2021. So included in entertainment technology, so we're not talking about technology that gets used to access homework or school content. Entertainment technology is watching TV, watching online videos, using social media, playing video or computer games, reading, creating digital content, listening to podcasts, using virtual reality technology, all of the entertainment stuff. So overall, we've seen that screen time usage has increased more in the last 2 years than it did in the previous 4 years. So we're looking at data points from 2015, 2019, and 2021. Overall, entertainment screen time use has increased by 17% from 2019 to 2021 for these ages. And then I've copied some graphics, which I took right out of the report that I think highlight some of this breakdown. So in this first graphic on the left, we can see in comparison, so the gray line is 2015, and then we have the medium green and then the darker green representing 2021, that we've seen this increase in screen time for both tweens and teens. So in 2021, the average daily entertainment screen time use was 5 hours and 33 minutes for tweens and 8 hours and 39 minutes for teens. Again, this is entertainment screen time. The perfect purple graphic in the middle shows us that boys are using screens more than girls are, that minority teens are using screens more than their white counterparts are, and that teens and tweens from middle income families, so middle income defined by an annual household income of $35,000 to $100,000, are averaging the highest daily screen time. And then we see in the third graphic that white families tend to have more access to technology as compared to minority families. 91% of white families have at least one computer in their home. And then higher family income is correlated with access to technology resources, which, it seems pretty straightforward. But the important point to highlight here is that it helps us to think about how this breaks down into disparity in digital access, which can lead to educational inequities for minority or lower income families. So it's not just this income, this access to a computer, it's access to all the information that comes with a computer. It's access to the social connection. It's all of these things. Like as we think about that, the layers of factors that we referenced earlier. We also see that 84% of teens, so this is ages 13 to 18, report using social media. So most teens are using social media, but only 37% of those teens endorse liking it a lot. So we can see this in between of using this, accessing it, having peer pressure to get onto social media, struggling with some of the content, struggling with what it means, what that process is. We also see that 38% of tweens, so 8 to 12-year-olds, are using social media. So this is a really big number, right? Especially as we think about 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds. We're talking about pretty young kids. I also want to note that the data from the census showed no increase in average time spent reading. So we're seeing this trend towards using more digital media over print media, and more social media over other types of digital information. So reading time when they surveyed did include reading like physical books or reading like newspaper articles or books online, but we didn't see an increase in any of that. So our youth are using social media, they're using YouTube, they're using Snapchat, they're not reading in the same ways that they're using other technologies, I should add. Okay. So digital literacy and fluency. So I just wanted to define this a little bit more clearly as we're thinking about communicating it. So we've highlighted the trends that we've seen these increases in digital use. Let's talk about literacy and fluency. So to just remember, literacy is the ability to read and write. Fluency is the ability to read and write well. So we'll kind of expand these definitions. Digital literacy refers to the ability to functionally use digital technology. So computers, smartphones, the internet, social media, those types of things. So digital literacy ranges from being able to access a web page, read a book on your device, all the way up to gauging the validity of a website or information online. Digital fluency is our ability to use technology well. So to discover, to evaluate, to use information and technology effectively and ethically. So I think we all fall into different ranges on the spectrum of digital literacy and fluency. But what's important to keep in mind is how youth build their digital literacy and their fluency, and how we as adults can guide them as they learn to think critically about the content they're interacting with online. Again, 38% of tweens are using social media, so they're interacting with content online. Exposure to all this information the internet has to offer is happening for younger and younger age kids, which means it's important for us as adults to have an understanding of what information our youth are interacting with, how they interpret and critically think or don't about that information, and how exposure to all that information plays a role in their mental health. So some of the important things to consider as we're talking with our youth about their digital use and their mental health. So we know that more and more, especially with the pandemic, youth are finding social connections online. And social connections are so important. Social connection and relationships are the foundation for appropriate development and identity. And when we went home for the pandemic, online is the way we can make those connections, and they're really important to continue to make. We shouldn't discount the importance of our youth's access to social media and to the connections it can build online, but we can be cautious, and we can help them learn how to shift through the information, how to shift through the people they're meeting online, how to be safe, how to think critically. One trend we've seen is the rise in content and discussion about mental health symptoms and disorders on social media. So I referenced this earlier. We're breaking down stigma. We're defeating these barriers. We're really creating access to information in a great way. And there are some downsides to that. So TikTok is a really good example of a space that has access and content about mental health really frequently. You can start using hashtags, which is really the case across all social media platforms. But within TikTok, and just for reference, TikTok is a social media platform that uses videos, so short videos, 15 to 20 seconds, all the way up to a few minutes long, to share information. So you can search on TikTok using hashtags, and you can come across a lot of different information and a lot of different perspectives. There's a lot of accurate and helpful information available, and there's a lot of inaccurate and harmful information available, which is true across the internet. A lot of the content available on TikTok or on these types of social media platforms are sharing of the individual's experiences. So they're sharing their experience about their symptoms with their symptoms. And we've seen an increase in discussion about certain mental health diagnoses. Big ones. So we've seen increases in discussion about anxiety and depression and ADHD and trauma, those things we talked about earlier. We're also seeing an increase in discussion about some more of these more intense kind of mental health disorders, like borderline personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder. Which are really involved in really specific disorders. So once a user, someone going on to social media, starts engaging with certain content or material, such as mental health issues, the platform learns or uses algorithms to help give you more of that content. So it learns you're interested in that, and it suggests other similar content for you to view. Which then increases the amount of mental health content that you're exposed to. And this field can narrow and narrow and narrow in so many ways, which can distort your perspective on reality. So if I go online and I start viewing content about mental health or specific content about borderline personality disorder, I'm going to get a lot of suggestions, and I'm going to kind of go down that rabbit hole, and maybe have a sense that borderline personality disorder is really common, or a lot of people struggle with it. In comparison, we know that only 1.4% of the adult population is diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. So this dissonance happens, right? Where you're exposed to a lot of content, you're surrounded by it, it feels really normal, but in reality, we are not seeing that as something people are experiencing all the time. So because so much of this content is available on social media, and it's created by the folks who suffer with these diagnoses versus a mental health professional kind of talking about what that diagnosis is. And there is that content available, but the majority of it is these self-identity kind of experiences. It can be unfair, or can give us kind of a skewed view that we use as a generalization out of context. And it's helpful to note that a lot of the symptoms that some of these more serious mental health disorders, like borderline personality disorders, are symptoms that are typical of adolescence. So just to go through a few of the symptoms of borderline personality disorder: a fear of being alone, having unstable or changing relationships, having poor or unstable self-identity, having mood swings, having anger outbursts, having feelings of emptiness. These are all symptoms that we see within this diagnosis. These are all things that adolescents experience at one time or another as a normal part of development, part of developing their self-identity. So when we look at this kind of qualitative data, this person's experience that they're sharing with us about their disorder and these symptoms, these users or youth can really take that and turn it into the serious worry that they have this disorder, this kind of phenomenon of self-diagnosis. I think I have this thing because I have these types of symptoms. And again, we all have a lot of these symptoms. That doesn't mean that it rises to kind of the occasion of a disorder. But these are the conversations that are really helpful. So having an understanding as an adult of what our youth are interacting with, what content they're exposed to online, and pulling back on that and helping ground them in some sense of reality for what they're experiencing, and normalizing their experience of these symptoms and assessing, right? All right. Excuse me. Another kind of point, and I don't have a lot of data about this, but I know that a lot of the social media platforms have started to have more regulation and oversight, particularly related to safety and content around safety online. If there's content about self-harm or suicidality, those posts are taken down. I'll also note that there is a lot of content about eating disorder stuff online. There's a lot of controversy about eating disorder content on social media. A lot of eating disorder stuff has started to be removed from social media by these platforms, which is a good thing. I didn't talk about or touch on eating disorder stuff today. I think kind of opening that up could be a whole presentation in and of itself. But I do kind of want to note that it's important to kind of keep an eye out or keep an ear out for those kind of content from your youth. So are they talking about how their body image is? Are they talking about how their eating patterns are you seeing changes in their eating, changes in how they look? Those types of things are also important mental health factors. Okay, so I want to kind of move into, if I can get over here, we go. Some ideas for what we can do. So we're adults and we are interacting with youth and hoping to help them as they learn and grow and develop through all of this. And it's important to help them process the contents that they're engaged with and exposed to. And I think it's important for those of you who are parents or for those of you who are thinking about having these conversations with youth that you're really close to in your life. It's important to remember that as a parent, as a guardian, you know your youth really well. You know your youth even better than their therapist might know them or their teacher, right? You have a really good sense of who they are, their rhythms, their patterns, their personality. They're kind of normal or they're not normal, not doing so well. And it's important to kind of trust how you know them, how well you know your youth, to guide your interactions with them. And everything that I'm mentioning here is just kind of guidelines. It's a framework for these conversations, but the rest gets filled in by the relationship you have with your youth. That's really the important and formative part where we see change gets made in that relationship. So hopefully these are just some helpful ideas to keep in mind as you're having these conversations. An important place to start when having a conversation, this sounds a little silly to say, but I think we all need the reminder, myself included, is we want to put down our technology. So it's really difficult to be attuned to and in sync with your child if you're distracted. So if you have your phone in your hand, if you have the TV on, if the radio is on, things like that. And it's hard because we're busy. We have things to do. We're trying to make dinner. We're trying to do this and that, but really mindfully kind of focusing and setting aside that time to have a conversation with your child is so important. So we're going to start with listening. It's a really basic foundational piece, but active listening is so important with your kids. So we're busy, like I said, we've got a lot to do, but our kids know when we're distracted. They know when we're busy. So really focusing, taking the time to sit down with your child and actively listen to their experience is a really important starting point. We want to listen to them through the lens of kindness and compassion. We want to make eye contact. You want to sit with your body facing their body. You want to make the appropriate facial expressions. So often a noise, kind of a response noise or a facial expression can be so much more powerful in helping our kids feel heard than a verbal response. Showing your child that you're emotionally in sync and attuned to them through your body language, through your eye contact, can be even more important and more validating for them than just saying the right thing, because they really feel that connection. And it's important to remind yourself that when you're listening, you do not have to, and probably should not be, problem solving. I think for us as adults, it's really easy to jump into problem solving or advice giving mode because maybe we've been through that thing before. Maybe we know what the answer is. Just listen to us. We can fix this for you, right? We want to fix our kids' problems. We want to take away their distress. But what's really important in this listening part of the conversation is to listen. So taking that step back and just listen, be curious, work to understand their experience, open your ears up. We also want to use empathy. So having empathy means that you can put yourself in your child's experience. So you can try to understand what they're feeling and why they're feeling that. So understanding with compassion is really important for helping your child feel seen and feel heard. If your child thinks that you don't or can't understand, which I think we see often, right? Like, you just don't get it. You have no idea what I'm going through. It's a really common experience that adolescents have. If you experience that, it can be helpful to gently invite them to share more with you. I want to understand your experience. I would love to know how you're feeling, what you're thinking, what you're going through. If they aren't in a space where they can or want to share more with you, that's okay. And I think it's important to let them know that that's okay. So saying, that's okay. When you are ready to share with me, I would love to know more, right? So really connecting in that way. It's also really important to co-regulate when you're having these conversations. So when I say co-regulate, I mean kind of our physical presence and our physical body sensations. So when one person in the conversation is really regulated, so calm, having a normal heart rate, having neutral emotions, it can help the other person in the conversation either re-regulate, so kind of come from a dysregulated state where they're not calm, where they're experiencing intense emotions, bring back down, or it can help them stay regulated rather than becoming dysregulated as the conversation becomes difficult. So these are important things to consider as well. Excuse me. You want to make reflections throughout the conversations you're having with kids. You want to make tracking statements. Tracking statements show your child that you are with them, where they are in their conversation, you're following, you're understanding. And you want to make emotional reflections as well. Tracking can be nonverbal. You know, you're making eye contact, you're responding with a noise, you're saying, oh, ooh, ooh, right? You're showing that you're attuned and paying attention. It can also be helpful to have specific verbal tracking statements every so often. That was really hard for you. Oh, wow, that sounds intense, right? So you're interjecting, you're following with them. And then it's also helpful to reflect your child's emotional experience. You felt worried when that happened. So you're attuned to their experience and you're helping label it for them. And you can trust your intuition in this. You know your child, right? And the really cool thing about making reflections is that if we say, you felt really worried, our child feels that we're seeing and hearing them. And if we're wrong, if it wasn't worry, they're going to tell us, no. It was this other thing, right? And you're having that conversation. So it's a really great place to be. You want to engage with curiosity, of course, using statements like, tell me more about that. I would love to hear more about that. Things like that can be really powerful. So using that curious lens, again, versus that problem-solving lens, I know what you need to do, can help your child feel really seen and heard. You don't want to dismiss your child's concerns. Again, this sounds like a simple thing to say, but I think really often we just want to reassure our child or help them feel better. We want to take their problems away. We don't want them to feel distress. But we want to be really careful when we're doing that to make sure that we're not dismissing or invalidating their feelings or their experiences. So if your child is sharing a feeling of anxiety, say about an upcoming event or something, instead of saying, you'll be fine, which could be dismissive, you want to try reflection, maybe with a supportive statement. So you want to try something like, it feels really scary to anticipate this big thing. You're so brave to do this, right? So you're validating, you're naming, you're labeling for them. You can also say something like, this is really hard. I'm so sorry you're feeling this way. You know, you're present with them. And then the last thing that I think is really important to kind of keep in mind is when you should seek professional help. So if and when you reach that point where you identify that your child is struggling in a way that's impacting their overall functioning and their well-being, it's really important to bring them in for a more thorough evaluation. And that can start with your normal healthcare provider. You can start with coming somewhere to seek counseling services, but just looking and saying, you know, I think my child could use some extra help. Where do we start? Counseling can be really helpful in sorting through these types of things and finding a shared language for parents and kids to come together and communicate and being able to define and identify what's going on and what needs to shift. And it's really important, I think, to show your kids that they're worth help, right? They're worth the time it takes and the energy and the investment in feeling better, but that's valuable. And I think the biggest takeaway from that is you listen to your gut. You know, when you're talking about a child, your own child or a child that you're really close to in your life, you know them really well. So you know what their off version looks like and you know when they need a little bit more help. Okay. So I want to kind of wrap up there and I want to open us up for thoughts, questions. What questions do you have? How are you feeling? What would be helpful to talk more about?
Thank you so much, Mary, for that really informative and data-filled and also really compassionate presentation. I really personally appreciate it, and I know that we have a lot of folks that are on the call that have children themselves that also work with kids. I see a lot of my colleagues here as well. So I wanted to start off with one question and also encourage folks to either raise their hands, as I see Steph has done, or to, put in the chat any kinds of questions that they may have as well. But to get us started, I would love to ask you if you could maybe talk a little bit more about how people might discern or know when it's appropriate to move from having these kinds of compassionate conversations with their own children or kids that they work with, and then moving into seeking professional help.
Yeah. So I think, it's kind of started in this idea of evaluating your child or the youth that you're working with through the lens of how you know them and what you see as kind of their normal. And when you notice that something has changed and has changed over a period of time, right? So we're not talking about having a bad day or feeling really irritated or sad on a certain day. We're talking about kind of changes in functioning overall. So I'm seeing that my child is really struggling to go to school, is really struggling with sleep, so these big kind of things that impact our overall health and well-being. Have changed and are not alleviating. You've checked in, you've had these conversations, you're trying to identify what's going on, but your child is struggling and is suffering in some ways. I think when we see that prolonged change is when we say, okay, I want to get you some extra help. I want to talk to someone, and having that conversation with your child. I think starting at this, hey, I see you're not feeling that. I see you're really struggling with your sleep. I see school is not fun like it used to be. What would it be like if we went and talked to someone? I think it could be really helpful if we talk to someone about what might help you feel better. So we always want to join our youth, regardless of age, in that process of seeking help. We're not doing it for them. We're not solving their problem for them. We're bringing them into it. And it's a space for them to process. So yeah, just really noting where is it that I've seen change? And I'm keeping an eye on it and I'm tracking. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse?
Thanks so much, Mary. Steph, I see that you have raised your hand. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Sure. Thanks so much, Mary. One thing, you've given a lot of great information here. One thing that I think we all know is that the availability of services of late has been a real issue. Not only in your industry, everywhere, but do you have suggestions apart from what you've already shared with some strategies for caregivers who are maybe in that in-between space of being able to find a provider or get to that first appointment? Are there some concrete things that people could do to bridge that gap until they're able to get to more professional treatment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it really is. I mean, we, across the board are experiencing the staffing shortage. And, I think I could double the size of my staff and we still wouldn't have enough. There's so much need. I think that parents, talking about technology and social media, there's a lot of content online. There's a lot of really great resources available online and also in books and things like that. So I think accessing some of that, kind of figuring out, how old your kid is, what developmentally is going on, what they're struggling with, and narrowing it in that way, and doing some online research. Of course, anytime we're doing online research, we want to think critically. We want to view it through the lens of, is this a reputable source? Is this information accurate? Things like that. I don't know that I would recommend saying like, oh, peppermint essential oil will solve this problem, right? So we want to look at lots of different resources and figure out different avenues. I also think there's a lot of community resources. So there's these in-between resources in the community that aren't clinical services, but that can provide supports for parents, supports for kids. So getting kids involved in after-school programs, social connection, mentoring, having parents have access to some extra support. If there's parenting groups or support groups, And I think Syracuse has a good amount of resources in these types of ways. And it's just getting connected to those networks. I think schools often are really connected into these networks and can help as well. So touching base with the school counseling staff, letting the school know that you've seen these changes, asking the school what they've seen, pulling all the people, all the folks that are involved with your kids into this conversation, accessing all the resources and supports we can.
Thanks, Mary. And thanks for that question, Steph. I want to go into the chat with a question from Noelle and a follow-up from Steph. And Noelle, who is one of our kind of resident teen experts, wants to know a little bit more about what you do in school settings, and also is curious about potentially working together at the Y, because she works with teens and really would like to get more information on what a possible partnership might look like. And Steph commented that they think Noelle is correct in that, and that the Y could be a space to really offer more support in this way.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to clarify, when you want to know more about what we're doing in schools, are you asking in general what school-based services tend to look like, or are you asking specifically what Helio is doing or what our clinics look like? I just want to make sure that.
Yeah, specifically what you guys are doing in the districts that you had mentioned in the beginning.
Yeah. So to be more specific, we are in Helio has satellite school-based clinics in the West Genesee School District, in Marcellus, in Skinny Atlas, in West Hill, and in JD, Janesville DeWitt School District. And we will be expanding into Tully for the fall, pending all of our state stuff. So what it is, it's a kind of replica of our clinic-based services, but on site in the school building. So the big part there is the access to treatment for families who might not otherwise be able to get to our downtown clinic, or who don't want to pull their kids out of school, because obviously that takes so much longer than just going to an appointment while you're already in the school building. So we're providing clinical services. So we have licensed clinical staff, so mental health counselors, social workers, creative arts therapists, marriage and family therapists, right in the school building to be available to do clinical sessions. And it looks quite similar in terms of work and scope to what we're doing in our clinic here. So we operate under all the same kind of regulations and guidelines, provide the same kind of treatment. We are not school district employees. So all of our school-based satellites are satellites of our Helio Health clinic. So any of our clinicians who are in those schools are only able to provide treatment, clinical services for students whose parents have enrolled them in the program. So our folks are not intervening with kind of school-based crises or helping with school counseling suite stuff. They're only engaged with clinical services for the families and students who have been enrolled in services, but that looks like family therapy, individual therapy. The families who are receiving services through our school-based clinics are able to access all the services our main clinic has. So all the psychiatric services, our psychiatric rehab services, which are more kind of skill building, social development, hand over hand, parent support and guidance. So they're able to have access to all of that. So it looks very similar to a clinic. It just happens to be in the school. I will, and I think we'll have to follow up on your second question about the why. I think that sounds like a good offline conversation to kind of really dig into what you're seeing at your sites and what you see the need as, and how we might be able to serve some of that need.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I will definitely be emailing you.
Yeah, please.
Thanks so much. Do we have any other questions or anyone that would like to unmute, join the conversation? Okay, well, if not, I would be happy to put you all in touch with Mary. She has also shared her email right on the slide that's still up if you are here with us today. And as I usually do, I would like to just ask you, Mary, if there's any kind of closing thoughts that you'd like to leave us with today.
Oh, that's a good question. So I think that mostly I'm so excited to be here because I love having this conversation. Obviously, this is the work I do, but it's so important. And we've really seen that youth have really struggled. And it's great to be able to provide these resources and supports. And I think the more we can educate our community, the more we can have these conversations amongst our community members. And I hope you guys kind of take some of this stuff and bring it home and continue this conversation, talk about it, and interact with this material. I think the better off our youth will be, the better we're serving them and identifying their needs and helping them get access to help if they need it.
Well, thank you so much, both for that insight and also just for the generous presentation that you gave today. Thinking back on it, obviously with access to understanding the greater landscape of what youth mental health looks like, but also just some tips and guidelines for how to really understand and come to common language, but also like, what does it mean to have a supportive conversation? And I think that those tools and those tips are something that are effective and kind and supportive, not only for youth, but I think also for like anyone else in our lives, right? So I just want to thank you for bringing that into the space and for offering that to us today. And I know that I and many other folks on the call are looking forward to hopefully continuing this conversation offline.
I am as well. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for listening.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate you for showing up, and we will see you soon. Farewell.